Good evening, everyone. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of you for joining us tonight for our panel presentation to talk about really a look ahead to our second semester and in fact, all the way to 21-22. So we have a fine panel of folks who have been working all semester and into our future here to figure out just what we will do as the second semester begins. And we're also starting to plan for the upcoming school year. I want to recognize and thank the Communications Committee of our Board of Education. In their last meeting, we were talking about how to engage our community in the topics that are important to them. And this was their idea to put this program together. So I want to thank them for their help, guidance, and support. So our plan for tonight, well, let's start with some introductions with the individuals who are on the screen. These are a subset of the members of our reopening planning committee. And I will start with our high school principal, Mike Piscatelli, and Mr. Tim Murphy, our safety specialist. And we also have Regan Johnson, who is our assistant superintendent for HR. And also with us tonight is Amy Perrat, our communications specialist. And we also have Michael Laster, our middle school principal. And also with us tonight is Mary Swaggerman. She is our head nurse here in Guilderland. And we also have Mr. Neil Sanders. He is our assistant superintendent for business. And last but not least is the elementary principal, Dr. Alan Lockwood. So I'm going to take a minute here and share my screen. I have a PowerPoint presentation. I promise it's not too long. Let me get that up there and then I'll talk about our next steps. Okay, so as I promised, our program tonight is called Looking Ahead to Second Semester and also to 2021-2022. And I'm here with members of our reopening task force. So here are the topics we want to cover this evening. First, I just want to share some highlights from our first semester, really in a photo montage of that. I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about COVID-related topics, including some data around our cases of coronavirus here in the district. And then we want to talk tonight also about our COVID-19 testing plans and also a little bit about vaccinations. Also tonight, we're going to talk about second semester. It's coming right up upon us on February 1st. We want to share with you some information and where we are and respond to some of the questions that you submitted. And then toward the end of the presentation, I'll hand things over to our Assistant Superintendent for Business, Mr. Neil Sanders, to provide a 30,000 view foot of our budget planning for next year. I also want to note that the bulk of our program tonight will be spent responding to questions that have been previously submitted. We received over 100 questions from faculty, staff, students, parents, and community members. So I thank all of you who did that. And then if there's time, we may be able to answer some additional questions that come to mind while you're watching the program. And you can see the email address. You should be sending those to our reopening@guilderlandschools.net. And Amy Perrat will be monitoring that and sending them my way as we get ready. So let's jump in and get started and just hit some highlights from 2020, 2021 so far. I want to let you know that a couple weeks back, I mentioned to our members of our leadership team that I was hoping to have a few photos to be able to include in this presentation. And they asked their staff to send me photos, and I have to tell you, I have been overwhelmed with terrific pictures from all of our buildings. And so I'm going to talk very little and just let you enjoy these scenes from around the Guilderland Central School District. This is Halloween, socially distanced and remote. And there's Olive in her costume from GES. And there we have some friends hard at work. And I believe that's Gal getting some training and a treat. And some remote gingerbread persons. And then over at Pine Bush, we had quite the gingerbread hunt. And there's Mr. Sanita doing his part. Here are some scenes from Altamont. You can see we love our labradoodles here in Guilderland. And our artwork. Here are some friends from Farnsworth Middle School in their art class. And lots of music. We have elementary, middle, high school, remote, in person, socially distanced, but our music program is alive and well here in Guilderland. We're very happy for that. And I'm sure it comes as no surprise that our photography class sent me lots of photos. And here's a group of students outside of Guilderland High School. And a collection of some of their very creative work. And no one will forget our tremendous snowstorm back in December, but these ladies from Westmere Elementary School turned the snowstorm into something quite lovely. So I want to thank everyone who shared photos. The reality is the photos make it look like everything has been easy as pie this first part of the school year. Of course, it has been really quite the challenge, and people have worked tremendously hard to make sure we have as good an experience as we can for our children under really unprecedented times. So I really can't thank our team enough for rising to the occasion and making all of this really happen for our children and our families. So I want to transition right now, kind of talk about some of the things that we're working on, and I'm going to take you back just ever so briefly to August. This is a slide from one of our August panel presentations when I spoke about the principles that guided our reopening plan. And they still hold true. We continue to adhere to state level guidelines and ensure the health and safety of our students, faculty, and staff. We're continuing to work as hard as we can to maximize instructional opportunities for all of our students. But we have prioritized our in-person instruction for our youngest learners and for those who need some additional assistance. And then this last one about flexibility has proven to be the one that we exercise the most each and every day. Since we've opened, we have had to be flexible in transitioning to a remote instruction, both at the classroom level, at the building wing level, and at the entire building level. As you know, we are at this point fully remote in grades 8 through 12. I just want to point out that all of our transitions to remote instruction have been a function of staffing shortages that are caused by quarantining requirements. I know there were some questions that came through in preparation for tonight about, is there a magic number? Is there a threshold number where we decide of absences or staffing shortages that make us determine whether or not we can be open? And it's just never that clear cut. Every single circumstance has its own unique characteristics, and we need to look at them each and every way, whether or not positions can be filled with a substitute, whether we need to have a substitute at all in certain positions. So it's a complicated, a case-by-case basis. But the theme has been flexibility, and so on everybody's part, and we're appreciative for everyone working with us to make all that happen as smoothly as it possibly can. So the health and safety measures that we started speaking about in the fall still hold. They are all continuing to be the way we run our buildings right now and the things that we're asking everyone to do. And these will all be in place throughout the rest of the school year. And I guess I'll say at least, because we don't know what next year will bring. We had a number of questions about whether or not there's any chance that we would be bringing more students back in person with the arrival of vaccines. And the answer to that is very few students will be returning, even though we'll have the vaccine. I'll be talking a little bit more in the program about some plans we have for doing so. But the bottom line is all of these will continue to be in place. We'll continue to need to wear face coverings and use PPE, even as more and more individuals get vaccinated. And we'll need to continue our work around contact tracing and quarantining and testing, following the guidelines of the Albany County Department of Health. And so I think our reality that we are living now is likely to be very much the same over the next several months. So the next thing I want to share with you is a summary of the positive cases that we've had here in Guilderland. And this is the cumulative positive cases from September 8th, which was our first day of school for students, through Monday, close of business. These are the numbers we report to the state dashboard. And so I just want to say a couple things about this. We had a question about how this data gets reported and when. Our COVID coordinator is Mr. Neil Sanders. He is our assistant superintendent for business, and he is the person who every single day that we are in session needs to log on to the data dashboard and report all of our confirmed positive cases as of 4 p.m. We have to enter our data by 4 p.m. each and every day. I also want to point out the asterisk next to our high school, because you see the high school is attributed with the most cases within the district. We have all of our staff, however, who are not otherwise assigned to a building. They are counted in the Guilderland High School count. We need to do that for the portal where Mr. Sanders reports. So we try to do that consistently with our own internal reporting and our reporting to families. So our transportation employees are all counted in the high school. Our maintenance staff who are not assigned to a building are counted in there, as is the district office. So those numbers are a little bit inflated in terms of being just attributed to our high school. And we had some feedback about the importance going forward of delineating that more in our regular updates regarding positive cases. The other thing I just want to point out is at the bottom of the page, I've included the total cumulative percentage of everyone who is counted within our school district. That's all of our students and all of our employees. Our total percentage of positives is 1.79%. And again, that's not in any given day, that is cumulative going back to September. So I'm going to transition here to talk a little bit about screening tests. And I'll try to provide just a little bit of context here. I know the news has been filled with this micro cluster zone strategy that the governor has been talking about, where communities based on their infection rate and other metrics could be designated either yellow, orange, or red. And each of those designations, when this was first laid out, had certain parameters for a variety of organizations and entities, including schools, about the level of testing that would need to be done in order to remain open. However, even though we have met and surpassed some of those original metrics here in the capital region, we still have not received a designation at this time. So we are not designated in a zone. Because of that, well, in preparation for being designated as a zone, we went ahead and ordered the Binax Now COVID-19 rapid antigen tests that the New York State Department of Health has provided free of charge to all schools in New York State. These are the tests that the only tests that we have been given access for this purpose. However, we hadn't been able to use them because we had not been designated. It was quite clear we needed to be designated before we could. However, all that changed on Friday, late afternoon, when the Albany County Department of Health said school districts may use these tests in order to do some surveillance testing of their in-person faculty, staff, and students. So this isn't a requirement. It's not a mandate. These words I'm reading here in this third bullet came right from a message from our Commissioner for Public Health, Elizabeth Whalen. She said testing may be helpful and assist in decision-making regarding the overall health and safety of our schools. And then she also recommended that we work toward testing 20% of our in-person staff and students biweekly. And she also suggested that if our positive rate is above 10%, we would strongly consider remote learning. A couple things I want to point out. Actually, let me hold on that. I just want to underscore that these percentages are not required, but they're recommendations, and we are going to strive for testing 10% of our in-person staff and students. We're going to do it over a 2-week period, but we will not be attempting to do it every 2 weeks, and I can say more about that in a bit. And also, just anecdotally, I don't know if you noticed in today's newspaper, but Albany City School of Albany began their testing on Monday, and so far they have not found any positive cases in about 100 tests that they've done so far. So that's really good to know. So I just want to say a couple things about our plan. When we turn to the Q&A, I'm going to ask our head nurse and our safety specialist to talk a little bit more about this, but we're going to be sending notification to all consenting parents of children and staff who are randomly selected to participate in surveillance testing. This is voluntary, so no one will be required to do it. We've had a couple questions from people that they consented, but now they've changed their mind. They'll just need to let their building principals know that they want to be taken off the list, and we can do that. So that notification will be going out tomorrow to families. Actually, if you are a GES family, you may already have that because we'll be starting, as you'll see in the next bullet. We're going to be starting on Friday at GES as kind of a soft start to get this under our belts a little bit to see how our processes work and whether or not we need to tweak any of the processes. And then other buildings will follow from there. And as I said, we're aiming for 20% over a 2-week period. Couple other details. We'll only test asymptomatic students. Individuals who may have tested positive previously will not be tested using these. If it's once you've tested positive, you can test positive again for a long period of time after, so we won't be testing those people. After we test our students, we'll be sending an email home to parents to let them know that they were tested. However, if they're tested and they tested and it comes back positive, we will have to call families and ask them to pick up their child, and they may want to consult with their family health care provider and consider a follow-up PCR test. And then the data from the testing will be reported to Albany County through their secure electronic clinical laboratory reporting system. So the data of our students and faculty and staff will remain secure. So we have a little video here to show how this goes.
I am the school nurse here at Pine Bush Elementary. This is my son Dominic, and today we will be demonstrating what it looks like to have a COVID test at school. This is the rapid test we will be using to see whether you are positive or negative. And this is the Q-tip that we'll be using to swab both of your nostrils. First, I will open the card and get it ready. Then I will ask the student to remove their mask. I will then gently swab the student in both of their nostrils with a Q-tip. I will then place the sample into the test card and close it up. After 15 minutes, we will read the card to see if it is positive or negative. As you can see, one line will appear for negative and 2 lines if they are positive. Now that we've done the test, how was it, Dominic? It's very easy. No makeup to do it. If you have any questions about COVID testing in school, please reach out to your school nurse or your building principal. Thank you.
Well, we want to thank Janine and Dominic for putting together that video. In our communication that will go home to families, they will have a link to that video so they can watch it again. And then I also need to recognize and thank Mr. Laster and our floating nurse, Maria Stojevich, who also made a video that we will share with our middle and high school community. So there will be ways for folks to see exactly what this will look like and feel like for them. The last health-related topic I just want to touch on a little bit has been in the news a lot, and that's vaccinations for educators. Educators have now been designated in Group 1B in order to receive their vaccination. And the health department officially began accepting reservations for those appointments on Monday. And I'm really thrilled to say that some of our staff have already received their first dose and others have appointments. So this is just great news. It will be a game changer, but it's a game changer for which we need patience. At this point, the access to the vaccinations is still a challenge because the doses are scarce. So it's going to take some time for everyone to be vaccinated, probably several weeks. So the district will share information and links with our staff when we learn of them. What we've seen is get a link and there'll be appointments available for X number of people, and then within minutes they are all accounted for. So hopefully the supply of vaccine will become more robust soon and we will be able to quickly get folks vaccinated. We did have a couple questions about whether or not the district would help vaccinate students. And I just want to point out that at this point, students are not eligible for the vaccination, but absolutely when they are designated, we can look into playing a role in that if so. The other thing I want to share is that we had a question about would Guilderland High School become a place where people could get their vaccination? And GHS has been designated in the past as a point of dispensary. We are not that for this vaccine yet. Let me be clear, we're not that yet. But if we were to be asked to do that, we would gladly assist in helping get our community vaccinated. So I'm going to shift gears again to talk a little bit about second semester, and I'm going to start with a little bit of data. You see the relatively low numbers of families who are making a change to either return to in-person from hybrid or to transition to completely remote. The high school has the highest numbers there. So the other thing I'll point out, we also ask families to tell us about their plans for transportation. We actually have 255 students transitioning back to riding the bus, but 378 who have opted out of transportation for the second semester. And this means that we can accommodate anyone who wants to take a bus without changing any of our runs or upending anyone's current circumstances. So a couple words about each of these. At the elementary level, there really are no significant changes to schedules, sections, or assignments. We had many families say, will our sections be all shuffled around because of the change? And the reality is there's very little change across the district. There's a couple exceptions to that. At Westmere, you saw Westmere had fairly high numbers of students returning. We're adding 2 cohorts, one at K and one at grade 2. And Dr. Beeney tells me that a very small number, about 5, may change sections in order to access services like ENL and to balance class size, and information will be going out soon to those families. And at Linwood, we have 2 kindergarten students who wanted to return, and they're actually going to be at Pine Bush for the balance of this year because we ran out of real estate in our kindergarten classes at Linwood. At the middle school, again, not a ton of changes. We have some students who are remote in Tawasentha House who will need to be placed in a different house. We have a small number of students who might need to be moved to a new team in order to access their second semester special area courses. Mr. Laster and his team are doing everything in their power to keep that as minimal as possible, and families will be notified as soon as they can. And there are no other programmatic or scheduling changes at this time. And then at the high school, we have been doing some listening to concerns raised about our hybrid model. This is the every other day, but teachers are teaching both in-person and remote students synchronously. And that has created a lot of challenges, both for our faculty and for our students. And so we actually have a group of stakeholders meeting on Friday morning of this week to discuss some ideas for changing the second semester schedule to some extent to support our students and our faculty and staff as well. But we do recognize that many of our students are struggling. Remote instruction is a challenge for some of our children. So we are identifying a small number of students who could benefit from daily instruction, and that work is underway right now. We're also identifying students who will work with our PM school teachers. There is no PM school operating this year, but those individuals are a great resource for working with some of our children who are struggling. And then we're also very much interested in providing some additional AIS, academic intervention support services during the school day for some of our students. However, there are some big remaining questions for second semester. It's probably a lot more than these, but these are the big ones on everyone's mind right now, and that is, will we have 3 through 8 ELA and math assessments? Will we have Regents exams administered in 2021? We are awaiting. Lots of questions about whether or not high-risk sports will ultimately be allowed. Basketball, football, volleyball, and so on. Those also are kind of in a holding pattern. And then lots of questions too from our students, particularly interested in what end-of-year activities and events will look like. And again, we're working through all of those things, but need guidance as to what will be allowed as we move into the spring. So with that, I am going to transition the speaking role here to our Assistant Superintendent for Business, Mr. Neil Sanders. to give us all an update on where we are with the development of the 2021-2022 budget. So Mr. Sanders, I'm going to hand it to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wiles. Normally at this point in time, we've shared some budget information with the board, and we're working through the budget process. Usually around the middle of January, we're actually at the point where we're waiting for the governor's release of state aid from his perspective for school districts, so we can start honing in on the rest of the budget process, giving some sense of what state funding may look like. That's still subject to finalization by the legislature, usually in April. But it gives us a good roadmap into what we're facing and what challenges we have with the budget. This year's been different. I would say in my 20 plus years of developing school budgets, we always have our challenges and some level of uncertainty, but never the level of uncertainty that we're facing in this particular year. So really, as we go through this budget presentation, the theme is really about how do we plan for a budget in the midst of such great uncertainty. And we have uncertainty in a number of areas. First, as I mentioned, uncertainty over state and federal funding for education. So right now, with a change in leadership in the country, a possibility of another stimulus package coming that has aspects of it that have been proposed related to state and local government financing, as well as educational financing, somewhat separate from that. A lot of uncertainty about what that package may look like, what it might mean for New York State, what that will allow it to do for education, or directly from the federal government, what could help us in terms of direct aid from the federal government. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the revenue side in a big piece of our funding in terms of state aid and federal aid. Also, what still is out there is New York State's announcement that they would withhold up to 20% of state aid to school districts this year. And although that's this year and not next year, what happens this year will impact next year. So what has not happened yet is the withholding of 20%. It hasn't been withdrawn yet, but it hasn't been enacted yet this year. If that were to happen, or some portion of that were to happen, that would certainly reduce our revenues for this year and would potentially cause us to have to use more of our resources this year that we wouldn't have available for us or for use next year. So that would have an impact on us. But again, we're still uncertain as to whether that will happen or not, and what the impact might be and how that might affect us this year going into next year. We also have uncertainty over the instructional model for next school year. So will we return to in-person or school as normal? Will we still have some elements of remote instruction? Or will it be a hybrid model, much like we have at the high school right now, an alternating day model where students come in one day and are remote for one day? So trying to plan for staffing for an instructional model, which is a large part of our budget, very difficult to do if we really don't know what the instructional model is going to look like. So again, wrestling with that issue of potentially what could that look like. And a lot of that will depend on the containment of the spread of the COVID virus. And we also have new strains that have developed. So vaccinations are key to determining what that instructional model will look like next year, how that rollout works. If people are vaccinated, can we get to herd immunity, things of that sort. So at this point in time, there's significant issues that make it very difficult to have a solid plan for a budget that will support what we want to do educationally with students next year. So to bring some context and assumptions to the budget development process for next year, we have to make some decisions. What we've decided to do is we're going to assume that we're going to return to typical in-person instruction without any of the social distancing requirements that are in place right now that would limit class size cohorts, bus ridership, and those types of things. So in order to move forward, we really need to pick one model of instruction that we can go forward and budget for, because the models are all different. So at this point, we have hope that the vaccine will work, that we'll be able to return to school as normal next year, and we'll work along the plans of return to typical in-person instruction. Also out there, again, on the revenue side, New York State has got a significant budget deficit, somewhere between $8 to $15 billion, depending on varying sources and what numbers are being used to calculate that. Whatever the number is, it's really significant for New York State and their ability to fund education. Also, as I mentioned, the new federal stimulus package could provide targeted funding for education, states and localities, but it hasn't been determined yet. And at this point in time, it would be very difficult to estimate, if that were to happen, what it would mean to Guilderland and what it would mean to our budget. So we really don't have any basis to move forward on speculating what that might be in the viability of any sort of projection at this point in time. But we do need to make some attempt to figure out what we're facing in terms of an overall budget picture. We need to plan for that. We need to try to start developing our budget around that. What we decided to do is develop some scenarios, and we talked about this in the fall, is how do we best start the budget process with so much uncertainty, and really came up with 3 different categories. So either best case, where if all things went, looking at the data that we have now and what we can reasonably expect, everything went right, that would be our best case scenario, or least costly scenario, if you will. In the middle would be our expected case, what we might expect if certain things were to happen, middle of the road kind of approach. And then if everything went as badly as it could, worst case scenario, what that might look like. And it will give us a perspective and a range to work within. Unlikely we're going to land exactly in one of these approaches, but it does give us some endpoints and a middle point, so something to work to. And we also will have some plans built around those. So if certain elements change, we'll be able to shift, but we'll know what we're shifting to, what the impact will be, and we'll have that pre-planning work done ahead of time. So just to give you some idea of some of the things that we're looking at, staff retirements, and though we're always reluctant to lose our cherished staff who have been here so many years and given such great service to our students, there comes a time when people move on and retire. And when that happens, there's a financial impact from that, and it's called salary breakage. And what it means is we typically, in a staff retirement situation, have somebody that's worked their way to the top of our salary schedule. When they retire, those positions are typically filled by someone more at the entry level, so near the bottom of the salary schedule. So the difference between an outgoing retiree salary and an incoming new person salary entry level is fairly large, particularly around teachers, and there can be some significant cost savings associated with that. So again, we hate to lose those people, but in the context of a budget scenario, we need to look at that, and because there is a financial impact from that. So again, expected case, and this is looking back historically across the district, we would typically expect to have 20 retirements, both of our instructional staff and our support staff. Best case, even though it's labeled best case, we don't want to lose those people, but if we had more retirements, that would increase the savings that we would have for the budget. Again, worst case scenario, we're talking about 10 across the district. That would result in less breakage and less savings in the budget. In terms of the teachers' retirement system, there is a contribution that the school district makes each year. That rate is determined by the teachers' retirement system. They have put out a bulletin that gives us a range, which is typical each year. The range this year is between 9.5% and 10%. They will finalize that prior to us finalizing a budget, so we'll know which rate we're working with. They always stay within their range. So what we're using in this example, expected case would be right in the middle, 9.75%. Best case, it's on the low side, 9.5%. Worst case, it's at the top end at 10%. Similarly, health insurance, the same thing. We've got some information from our carriers. We're looking at that data. Expecting health insurance rates to be around 5.5% increase, but could be in the best case 4.5%, or in worst case 6.5%. And then finally, on the revenue side, also looking at state aid. And as I mentioned, the state has already put out their possible reduction. So best case scenario, they don't reduce our state aid at all. And that's what they've done so far this year. They haven't touched that. Expected case might be 10%. We know the outer limit, worst case scenario, is 20%. So just going in the middle, 10% reduction in aid. But that gives us some parameters to work with as we go forward with our budget development process. So turning that information that we just talked about in terms of those best case, worst case, and expected case scenarios, applying them to information that we have in the current year budget and some estimates of what we can reasonably project for next year, we're able to kind of outline the two endpoints for a budget development process and somewhere in the middle that we might expect and have a starting point for a budget development process. So you can see from the chart, we have several categories, salaries at the top. So again, looking at that salary criteria focused primarily on not only expected increases in pay rates, but also retirements in salary breakage that may occur. You can see that best case is closest to our current budget, gets a little bit worse in terms of our expected column, and then increases much more for our worst case scenario. So best case scenario, least impact to increases in the budget, a little more in the expected category, and worst case scenario, even more. And looking a little farther down, benefits. So we've looked at things like the teacher's retirement system contribution and health insurance, as I just explained. And again, you can see the same variability there. As the rates get higher, the costs get higher as we move across the chart. Equipment, supplies, textbooks, contracted services, and BOCES services, those are areas where we typically have cost of living type increases, and that's what we would typically apply, and we've applied them in this case, but really not affected by those other types of best case, worst case, and expected case scenarios. They typically are just annual cost of living type expenses, so that they're the same in all of those cases. Our debt service is the same, again, because it's based on current borrowing we have, and that won't change. And then finally, we have a category called interfund transfers, which again, we've looked at that as a little bit of an increase is what we would expect over the previous year, but not influential on the overall projected expense column in those three scenarios. But as you can see from the bottom line, we're looking at a little more than $3 million increase in terms of our projected expenses in the best case. That climbs to about $3.5 million when we get to the expected case, and we're a little bit closer to $4 million when we look at our worst case scenario in terms of the expenditure side. And then following along, similar process that we used for expenses, we'll look at for revenues. And again, here state aid is the biggest chunk of that. It's about a quarter of our overall aid, so it's significant. And as we talked about, our best case scenario is there would be no reduction. We do have planned a little bit of reduction in the aid, but that's a function of how the aid rolls out based on certain criteria. But again, we're not assuming any reduction in that instance. For the expected category, we're looking at an overall decrease of 10%, in the worst case scenario, 20%. Local sources, we did look at a little bit in terms of what interest rates might change by, but there's very little variability we're expecting, but we did account for that a little bit, and then the numbers reflect that. Fund balance and reserves, this is money that we have in savings. We haven't made any changes over the current year. Those are the last things that we would typically look at in terms of balancing the budget and what we would need to do, and whether it's expenditure reductions or adding more from our savings. That's a decision we would make as we get farther along. But wanted to provide that information in terms of the overall revenue picture. Assuming all of that, what's needed in terms of a tax levy, the amount that we need to raise from the taxpayers is shown below in that property tax levy line. So again, similar to the expenditure chart, we're again looking at those same types of $3 million increase, $3.5 million increase, and close to $4 million increase. We have calculated a preliminary tax levy and limit calculation. And this is the amount that we could put before the voters without requiring a supermajority vote. And you can see when we look at putting that tax levy limit number in there, and then what adjustments we would need in order to make the budget balance and be whole. Best case scenario, we're still looking at a gap of about $2.5 million. Expected case, $5.5 million. In the worst case scenario, we're at $8.5 million. So significant gaps still from this analysis. Much work to be done in terms of the budget, and again, revenue being a key piece in what that might look like. Down at the bottom, you'll see that we have a fund balance line. This is the amount that we have in savings along with what's called restricted reserves. So this is money that we put aside for contingency purposes. Fund balance is what we would call unrestricted. We can use it for any purpose, help us to offset revenue shortfalls. Our restricted reserves, and there's a number of them allowed by law, we can put aside money in an account and save it for a particular purpose. So an example would be workers' compensation costs. We can put money aside for corresponding expenses. We can draw from our savings to pay for that. But we can only use, if the money was put aside for workers' comp cases, we can only use it for workers' comp expenses. We can't use it for other purposes. So that's the difference between fund balance and restricted reserves. Fund balance, we can use for any purpose to offset any expense. Restricted reserves, we would have to look at the category of expense. We can only use it for that type of expense and only up to the amount that we have in the budget for that type of expense. So if we have $100,000 in workers' compensation costs, we can use $100,000 out of the reserve, but we can't use $150,000 because we don't have expenses to support that. So again, it's money that's available to us, does have some restrictions in certain aspects. The other thing about both of these is once we use it, and if you think about it as constantly drawing out of your savings, if your expenditures and revenues don't match, in each month you're supporting yourself by taking money out of your savings account to make ends meet. It's the same idea. You never get beyond that. So you'll use that money out of your savings account, and we will too, but we'll need it again next year. Part of it's gone. If you can't stop using it, you create a hole that you're always going to have. We'll have a revenue hole. So we'll just continue to use that money until it's gone, and it will disappear in a brief amount of time if we continue to use it year after year. So we have to be very careful with our use of fund balance and reserves, knowing that it's not an endless pot of money. We're covering a revenue gap, and we don't have a good way to cover that revenue gap except going back to the same source and continue to draw that down. So you have to carefully manage fund balance and reserves in order to balance the budget. So with that being said, we still have several steps in our budget development process and wanted to share those with you. We're awaiting the executive budget proposal. As I mentioned, it's typically around the middle of January. I don't expect it to happen. There's been no talk of that happening. The state is occurring on a daily basis right now. There hasn't been any release of when that executive budget proposal might appear. But given all of the uncertainty around what's happening at the state and federal level and a possible stimulus package, wouldn't expect that anytime soon. So we'd expect that to be delayed for some period of time without any certainty as to when that might happen. But we are going to continue with our budget development work. Our administrative team is actively at work, planning for and preparing for a budget. We also will have opportunities for the community to provide input, and we'll be talking about that a little bit later this evening. Legislative advocacy is always important in any year, and especially important in this year. There's a lot at stake, a lot of uncertainty. We would ask people to keep that in mind, and we as a school district are certainly going to keep that in mind as we move forward. And then finally, we have the superintendent's draft budget proposal tentatively scheduled for March 2nd. That would be our normal schedule. We've added the word tentatively because I don't know that we'll be able to have that for March 2nd with all of the uncertainty that we have currently in the budget process. But as for now, that date stands, but it may change as we may need to change that as we move forward. So again, thank you. And I'll turn it back to Dr. Wiles.
All right, thanks so much, Neil. I'm going to just briefly mention that we're very much interested in guidance and advice from our community on our work as we develop our budget for next year, given all of the things that are kind of unclear for us, as Neil just described. So we'll be launching a thought exchange tomorrow. Look for communication from us. It'll be open for a couple weeks, January 14th through the 29th. And we will appreciate your input, and as always, take it to heart, because our community does offer us good insight and as we develop these very difficult things. So look for that. All right. We are now at the point where we're going to switch over to responding to the questions that were submitted to us ahead of time. And I'll just remind everyone that I'm going to ask our panel members, so I'll call on them to respond to some of the questions that are categorized by topic. We'll try to answer as many of these as possible. I tried to weave in answers to many of your questions in my presentation, so hopefully we have covered a decent number of those. And you can indeed email additional questions to reopening@guilderlandschools.net. So I'll just say thank you for joining us. Stay tuned. we'll transition to our Q&A section as I stop the sharing of my screen here. All right, thank you, everybody. All right, I'm going to begin, I think, with the topic where we received the most questions from our community. And I'm sure that won't come as any surprise to anyone that it's all about this COVID testing that we are gearing up to implement. So Mary, I'm going to start with you. I'm just going to ask you as the head nurse for the district, but also the nurse at Guilderland Elementary School, to tell our community, what is this going to look like for our children and for our staff from your perspective?
So good evening, everyone. I was actually hoping tonight to kind of give you a picture of what this is going to look like. As Dr. Wiles had presented, we are going to actually have a soft start this Friday at Guilderland Elementary. And under this plan, we are going to test 20% biweekly, which reduces down to 10% a week. And we've been working closely with our nurses to try to come up with the best plan, and looking at, our numbers at 10% in each building biweekly. We feel that the school nurse in the elementary level will be able to test their building population, in breaking it down to even as much as how many they would do daily. Middle school and high school, of course, are larger numbers. We are going to utilize our float nurse, Maria Stojic, to help with that, along with our nurses. But we feel that this gives us the flexibility as to when we do the testing. Of course, everybody knows that the nurses are involved in a lot of other things during their school day. So this breaking it down to a daily, weekly number allows nurses to actually section out a portion of their day to do the testing. Certainly on a slower day, if we could call it slower, they can do a little bit more. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what Friday is going to look like. And Dr. Lockwood and I have been meeting and met today just to talk a little bit about how we were going to manage Friday. And we actually I kind of looked at my schedule and picked 9 to 10 roughly, knowing that tends to be a more settled time in my office. And what we're going to do is actually bring a number of students down. And this way, I'm going to actually test in my office. And this way, say I brought 5 students down, they would be lined up outside my office, socially distanced. We would have, I have a person that helps me in my office who's a monitor, and she would be able to manage outside the door. And then one at a time, I will bring the students into a location within my office that is set up for the testing. And they will stand on a designated area, and I will certainly have my PPE on. But the swabbing test is very quickly. As you saw in the video, it is seconds, really. And once that's done, the student would put their mask back on, sanitize their hands, and off they would go back to their classroom. The process of this test, although it's quick to swab and have that student return to class, there's a timing component of that. So I'm looking at it as batch timing, and each test has to be timed at least in red, no sooner than 15 minutes and no later than 30 minutes. So I find that to be very manageable for me. I think that the students are going to be more comfortable. They know the school nurses. I think that's going to give them a piece of comfort. They're used to seeing us, certainly seeing us in PPE now, so I think it will be less scary. There was a couple questions about what if a child didn't want to get tested. Well, certainly that could happen. I see that happening, possibly in elementary, and certainly we would just say, that's fine, you don't have to get tested. We would not, If a student refused, then they would not be tested for sure. Let's see what else I wanted to say. So as far as the middle school and high school are concerned, they have designated testing locations that they're going to set up, and they will be assisted by our float nurse, and also our PE trainer has offered to help with that, Kate, and we're very, very appreciative of her assistance. And I'm just looking here.
Mary, can I just add, without embarrassing you, I just wanted to comment that the nurses have been fantastic throughout this planning process. Mary has spearheaded this whole planning operation. We met with the nurses yesterday. The float nurse, Marie, is fantastic. And we're going to stay in close contact, communicating with the nurses throughout this process as well, to be sure that it stays smooth. Mary mentioned the social distancing of the students as they approach the testing process. We'll also be disinfecting the area. Students will stand on a mat that's wipeable. It'll be disinfected periodically throughout the process. The nurses themselves, I believe, are using a double glove system where they'll remove the outside glove and disinfect between each student, between each test. They have to change the gloves and sanitize the hands. And the hand sanitizing will happen with the students before and after the process as well. So all of these things that played into our ability to keep the infection rates low in our schools will continue throughout this process. We don't want this process to hinder that, which is why we're getting the students in and out quickly and safely.
Thank you, Tim. Mr. Laster, can you put the middle school spin on this? What will this look like for our middle school students?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Wiles, and thank you, Mary, for spearheading the efforts. It's been great. And at the middle school, we're ready to go. When we have to start testing, we've designated our Learning Center classroom as the space that we've set up as the pod, basically as our point of distribution. Students will be invited and escorted down by one of our aid monitors, and we will begin the testing there, and then students will go back to class. If unfortunately a positive case does pop up, we will follow the protocol that we've been following per the Albany County DOH to begin our contact tracing. So again, I agree, it'll be very comforting for our students to have the test being conducted by the nurses that they know. I'll be up there. We'll have some aid monitors helping out with social distancing, but you know, we are ready to go when it's our turn. So.
Mr. Piscatelli, what about the high school?
Very similar to what Mr. Lasser said. Again, we're going to invite students to come down. We're planning on setting up the testing area around the West Gym area. Students will come in and out, get the testing done, return to class. With our staff, we're going to have to figure out something, but it's probably going to be inviting them down with the ones who have volunteered during their planning blocks to come down to it. But again, let me just echo what everybody has said. The nurses have done a phenomenal job through this whole process and have been essential for keeping this going.
That's great. Thank you, everybody. So we're going to learn a few lessons from GES and their soft start on Friday and debrief that on Tuesday, and then roll with across the district on Wednesday and then through February 1st. So great. Any other thoughts from this panel on the COVID testing piece? Any details that we didn't touch on, either between my presentation or your comments?
I know there were a couple questions about confidentiality, and I just want to reiterate that certainly is something that nurses guard very sacredly, is patient and students' confidentiality. So we will work very hard to make sure that's maintained. I think with the social distancing and testing separate away from the students that are lined up socially distanced, that provides an element of protection. This question also came up about what if a student tested positive we're going to be finding that result after the child has gone back to class, because we don't want children all waiting around in a large group anyways. But, certainly it would not happen right at that very moment that we got that the child was swabbed. So there is a little bit of time break, but we would definitely be very careful about, how we went about removing that child from the classroom so that they weren't, singled out in any way at all. And I just wanted to reassure parents of that, because I know that is a big concern.
That also reminds me about the confidentiality piece. Mary, what happens, or Tim, what happens to that little card that we saw Nurse Janine share after the test the timer is done and we have the result? What happens to that little packet?
That used packet becomes disposed as biohazard waste in a biohazard bag, which gets put into a basket with a foot pedal release. And the basket is stored in a locked space until it's picked up. And then it gets picked up by a vendor who has it incinerated. No one is to put their hands into the red bag, because that's considered, like I said, biohazard waste, or in this case, it's a risk of exposure to potentially COVID-19. So it's not the kind of thing anybody's going to go rummaging through, and we manage it very closely.
And then the data coordination submission is being done by Mr. Michael Bastian, who is our Chief Information Officer in the district, who handles confidential data every single day as part of his job. And he will be the person uploading the data to the system that I mentioned in the presentation. It's called eClares, but it's a secure vehicle that the county uses to collect medical information, laboratory information about individuals. All right, let me transition to the second semester. I'm keeping an eye on the questions coming in. We may double back, but I also want to make sure we cover as many as we can for those who sent their questions ahead of time. So I'm going to start at the elementary level as we think about the reopening of school. And Dr. Lockwood, I kind of hit the 30,000-foot view of return to school for our elementary students. Can you add some more based on the questions that we have, or just your perceptions of what the second semester will look like at the elementary level?
Sure. I think the second semester is going to look an awful lot like the first semester did. And I have to say, we've had a very successful first semester. We did get some great questions through the portal before this panel discussion, and I want to try and address some of those. There are a couple of questions regarding the placement of the current remote students who are coming back for in-person instruction. And one question was around when will those placement announcements be made, and we don't have a specific date for that yet, but we are currently meeting with our grade level teams and making those placement decisions right now. And we hope to get letters out next week and inform parents of where their incoming students will be placed. There's also a question or two in here about the current in-person students and the thought process around moving those students, potentially moving those students from their existing cohorts. And I have to say that the number of those students, the students who are currently in person who are going to be moved, is very, very small. And those that are generally so that we can better align some of the ENL services or special education services and be much more efficient with those services that we provide to students. I do not anticipate any wholesale movement of students. We won't be breaking up existing cohorts to make room for large numbers of in-person students returning. That's just not going to happen. There may be a rare situation or two where we have to make a couple of adjustments just to improve the learning environment in classrooms. But again, those are going to be very, very rare, and we'll let people know about those moves in the next week or so. We also had a couple of great questions here about the hybrid model and why aren't we using the hybrid model at the elementary level. And I really understand those questions, and I want to assure people that we spent a lot of time over the summer looking at that for the elementary level. And I know it's something that they're using in grades 7 through 12, but in the end, we determined that the learning behaviors and the needs of young elementary students are much different than those of our 7 through 12th graders. A teacher in an elementary classroom really spends little time doing whole class, traditional like whole class instruction, and really spends much more time creating small group activities and working with students in a very different way that really don't lend themselves to being tied to a computer and instructing in a hybrid model. And we felt that if we were started to ask our elementary classroom teachers to teach in a hybrid model, they just would not be able to effectively manage the class, both the class that was in front of them and the students that were working remotely, and could even potentially lead to some safety situations. We want to make sure that our teachers in front of our students are paying very close attention to those students in front of them. So the hybrid model was not found to be feasible for us. Similarly, along those lines, there was also another great question here about why can't a student who has to miss an extended period of school, for example, because they're in quarantine, why could they not go into an existing remote classroom for that period of time? And again, we just felt that would be, well, there are a couple of issues with that. It would be very disruptive to the learning environments in those remote classrooms that were existing. It took the remote teachers many, many weeks to teach their remote students how to navigate through the digital classroom and access all the instructional materials. And we just would not be able to get those students up to speed, the in-person students up to speed in the remote classrooms. Plus, they're in different places instructionally. Teachers have a lot of latitude in their pacing of the curriculum to meet the needs of their students. So there's just no guarantee that we could take a fourth grade in-person student and plop them into a remote fourth grade class and have them be in the same spot. So we are addressing those situations like we typically do for students who have extended absences, and we provide work for those students, either hard copies that parents can pick up, or in many cases now digitally that teachers can push out through learning platforms like Seesaw or Google Classroom that students are very comfortable with. So when they do return from school, they haven't really missed much, and the classroom teacher is able to get them up to speed again quickly.
All right, Alan, do you have one more? Or are you good?
Well, there's just a quick question here about distribution of Chromebooks if the schools go remote.
Great, yes.
And we have gotten pretty effective and efficient with that, and we've had to do that a couple of times already. And really, we have a district-wide plan with that, and if we were closed for a day or two, we would try and address any immediate needs that came up, and we've been able to do that. If we, heaven forbid, had to close down for an extended period of time, a couple of weeks or so, we would very quickly be able to get computers out to all of the students and continue with our remote instruction. We've had some practice with that, and we've been able to do that very, very quickly.
Great. Thank you so much, Alan.
Yep.
Mr. Laster, how about the middle school?
Thanks, Dr. Wiles. Similar to Dr. Lockwood, I think our first semester has been really, really great. Our teachers, our staff, our students, our families, we really, really appreciate all of the adhering to our new expectations and new normals of, social distancing and mask wearing and sanitizing and parking routines and traffic patterns, picking up students. So, it definitely takes a village, and because of everyone's efforts, the first semester has been as normal as it could be for our live in-person students at FMS. As we approach the second semester, we anticipate minimal changes to our structure, minimal changes to our program. We are welcoming some students back from Tawasenta, our remote house. And because of that, that group of learners will have to be placed in a different house on a different team. But all of our other houses and teams are poised to make sure that they transition back to live in-person instruction effectively. There may be a handful of students, very similar to what Dr. Lockwood said, that because of the need to support them better, or the need to make sure that they have the special area courses that they should have second semester, there may be conversations with families about some slight changes. But again, those are a handful of students. Our goal is to minimize the impact on students and program as we transition to second semester. So I did have a few questions that I'd like to just address for our families tonight. And I want to talk a little bit about the developmental importance to engage middle school kids in extracurricular activities and things like that. So some of the things that are coming second semester that are still running, students can participate in our Charlotte Book Club. Our GSA is running regularly. Our student council is just starting to get going here. Math Counts, our Facts Cares program. I'm also very pleased to announce that we're working with our teachers to produce some type of mask production for our FMS school community this year, which is a vital part of the fabric of FMS. So I'm really excited to see what that will look like second semester. So students and parents who are interested in having that type of experience, stay tuned. We're also going to be launching for our 8th grade friends our normal National Junior Honor Society process. We did have to make some adjustments, so our timelines are a little delayed because of those adjustments, but 8th graders will be getting some information from our National Junior Honor Society folks second semester. So I also got a question about the hybrid model for the middle school. We began this year trying to determine how to have live in-person instruction for our youngest students. If I would have had my druthers, I would have had all of our 5th, 6th, and 7th grade students come to FMS every single day. But unfortunately, due to our current limitations with class size and space, we weren't able to do that. Our teachers are working hard every day to find more ways to engage students in live meets when they're going remote. And that's whether, the increase in students who are going temporary remote due to quarantine situations has forced our teachers to sort of really consider how they do this. At the middle level, our faculty and staff, they understand the importance of connecting with kids and sense of belonging. So even while they're focusing on their in-person learners in front of them, they're providing those asynchronous activities for those students who are remote. Second semester, we look forward to trying to find different ways and new ways to engage kids while they are remote. The temporary remote status that is happening with students right now is definitely disruptive. It's not ideal. Our teachers and our students are doing a wonderful job working through that. And then the last question that was directed towards us was, do we anticipate any changes in our teaching assignments for our remote teams? So at this point, when we look at the numbers of students who are returning to live in person, and then we look at the numbers of students who are going to remote, we do not anticipate any changes in the teaching assignments for our remote teams. So we anticipate our remote 6th, 7th, and 8th grade learners will just continue with their current teachers on their current teams into the second semester. So we're excited to see what the second semester brings for kids.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Laster. Mr. Piscatelli, you're up to give us some insights into GHS in second semester.
I just want to start by commending our faculty and staff on how they've handled this. You know, we welcomed the 8th grade teachers into the high school, and they did a phenomenal job of making a wing be a full house for or a home for our 8th grade students, and have made it a special place, I think, for the kids. And with that, you know, that meant that many high school teachers had to relocate their classrooms to other spaces in the building. And teachers have worked incredibly hard together to make it work, to share space. And like I said, I couldn't be prouder. And they've also had to relearn how to teach in this environment, because we've been dealing with 3 cohorts basically that are very different. We've got students in person, they got students at home, and they got students who are always home and never in person. So they had to really relearn how to teach and adjust to either using synchronous teaching or asynchronous activities. But as the semester's gone on, it's incredible how their skills have just grown and grown and grown as we've gone through this process. And they're just doing a phenomenal job. And with that, I would be remiss without commending our students, because the first thing I noticed when we started was how diligent they were following our safety protocols. Very seldom this entire semester I've had to address any student about mask wearing. We created these one-way hallways around the building, and the students are following them to a T. I mean, that includes one of the ways to get back to another part of the building, they have to walk outside, even in the snow. And they have done that without complaints. So again, our students have been incredible through this whole process. You know, but with this has definitely been challenging. I mean, we know that we're probably our biggest challenge is having students who are struggling to engage when they're remote days, or if they're 100% remote engaging. So we're constantly looking for strategies to increase that engagement. One of the reasons we're having this meeting on Friday is to talk about different strategies and brainstorm some ideas of what can we do differently in the second semester. And I'm hoping that meeting we can generate some ideas that we can put into place. There are some constraints, though, that I just want to put out there that we know we're going to deal with going into this. Our drop-off time is set in stone. Our pickup time is set in stone. So we know the length of our school day is what it is, and it's not going to change. And with that, with our new start and end time, we've been dealing with reduced instructional hours from the get-go this year. So it's down from what we typically are. So ideas that are being floated out there that would reduce instructional time are probably not going to be considered at this, because we're already down where we are. But we're looking for ideas on how to help the students. We're welcoming back 90 students to the high school in the second semester. We've had to go through the challenge with a high school schedule and returning students in is because of the 14-person cap on each section. We got to go class by class and make sure that we can fit and welcome those students back in. But luckily, we are able to do that for every student. So we're excited to have them back, and we're excited about starting the second semester.
Mr. Piscatelli, I'm just watching Mrs. Peratt add a question that came in from a student right now, wondering about solutions for students who are seeking extra help. And I had mentioned a couple in my presentation, but I don't know if you want to just underscore what we're about there.
Well, certainly, some of the things we've been working on this continuously all semester. One of the first things we did is we were looking at our AIS and support programs that we have in the school, and we're trying to match it up with students who have struggled through the first quarter and have study halls that line up when those support services are being offered. And we're pulling more students into those support services, whether it be English, math, science, or social studies, we're doing that. We opened up just this week We typically have PM school, which is a service that is for students who are out of school. But we're using those instructors in that time differently this year, and it's more in a support role. So we have been working with the instructional administrators to identify a population. We've been reaching out to parents to see if they're willing to have their child access this support services, because the support services are outside the school day. But that has begun this week. So we've got students participating in that. And then lastly, now that we've kind of got it set in stone where semester 2 is, we're able to look at students who are struggling in school and see if we can bring them in on a daily basis rather than an every other day basis. So basically in the past week, we've been contacting parents, checking out their schedules and seeing if they can come back. But with that said, we're constantly looking for other ideas that we can do to support those students. So,
you know, we also received a question about how we're helping students and staff with social emotional well-being kinds of topics. And earlier today, Lisa Knowles, who's our PPS director, shared a list of things that are happening, and maybe this is a good time to remind everybody. We had a social emotional committee in our reopening plan who they've developed a student check-in form to help identify students who may not have a trusted adult in the building, and they're seeking to connect those students with a trusted adult. She mentioned that our counselors and social workers provide individual and group counseling services. They conduct classroom lessons on a variety of topics, all of which we could use: fostering resilience, developing coping skills, mindfulness, self-regulation, identifying feelings. She reminded me about our programs, Sources of Strength, the GSA, our Character Ed Committee, Northern Stars, and our own mental health clinic that's located at FMS. And there's many other things as well. I think it's important for our community to know that we're trying to serve all of our children, you know, mind and body and spirit during this very difficult year. Mike, before I let you go, any comments, anything you'd like to mention about athletic activities and, you know, kind of those special events that mark the high school experience?
sure. Let me start with sports. We did get one question about the high-risk winter sports, which we're talking about: basketball, hockey, wrestling, cheerleading. And right now, those are still on pause. And until we get clearance from the governor, those will continue to be on pause. The second fall sports will be starting in I believe it's the early March timeframe, I think, or end of January. I think it's going to be around that time. And then spring sports will have a tentative start date of April 19th. So that's going on. We, you know, as Mr. Lasser was saying, we have some co-curricular going on. We've got our GHS players that are getting together right now. We have our chamber choir and chamber strings that are getting together right now. And like we said, student government and classes are still meeting on a regular basis. So the extracurriculars. And we also have the low to moderate risk sports that are going on right now as well. So every day when I leave the school, I see the cross country team running around our parking lot and, you know, keeping active, which I think is really critical for mental health right there too. I'm trying to think. It was the second part you asked about that was in your question. What was the second part of that question?
No, it was extracurricular activities and sports, I think, were the two.
Okay.
All right, I'm going to transition to a mix of other kinds of questions. And Mr. Sanders, I'm going to start with you. We got a couple budget-related questions, and one of them was whether or not the district would consider offering a retirement incentive.
Thank you, Dr. Wiles. What's important to know at this point is there really is an incentive in every one of our contracts regarding retirement notice, and it really is pegged to notice. So what's important for the school district, and kind of what I mentioned before in my budget presentation, is we need to establish a budget with as much good information as we have. And if we can capture cost savings as part of that, certainly we want to do that. So the contract requirement is a notification requirement by February 1st of an intention to retire by June 30th. And knowing that in advance allows us to plan for that, plan for those savings, and be able to incorporate them in the following year's budget. So what I would say is we do have that in place already. It is available to folks. It is important for the notification. So finding out at the beginning of June or middle of May after we've adopted a budget that somebody's going to retire in the following year won't impact, we'll have already built the budget and already approved the budget at that point, so it wouldn't change that, and the difficult decisions will already be made. So that is already in place.
So I'm also going to, we had a question come in about state aid, and the individual mentioned Schenectady City School District has said, gone on record saying their state aid for 2021 is cut by 20%, meaning this year, and they actually laid off 400 staff. So why hasn't that happened here in Guilderland?
Well, that statement was made, and there was a plan laid out by the state of New York and the budget director of certain benchmarks, certain points in time that the state would evaluate, and if a certain threshold was met, that would trigger a reduction in state aid to school districts. That was the plan that was announced to all school districts, which we had worried about how that was going to work, and when those benchmarks were going to come into play, and what that would mean at that time, and what were we talking about in terms of a state aid reduction. Was it only foundation aid? Was it our full aid? And what it really got down to is it would be your full aid and 20% of that if those benchmarks were met. There was a lot of pushback, obviously, from a lot of groups about the impact to schools by having aid withheld for a budget that's already been established, for expenses that were already in play, or pandemic-related expenses that schools had to bear the burden of in the reopening. So it was unwelcome news to most people. City schools are in a little bit different situation than suburban schools. They have a higher aid ratio, so the impact of any state aid reduction is much more significant for a city school district than it would be for a suburban school district. So schools made decisions based on information that they had on the time, recognizing the start of school. And again, it doesn't impact every school district in the same manner. We're all getting hit by state aid reduction, but not in the same order of magnitude. We and many of our suburban councils counterparts did not adopt a strategy of layoffs. We decided to ride that out. What's happened so far is the state has not withheld any of the money this year. I think given the outcry from the community and in schools and legislators probably influencing that decision as well. Hopefully that won't occur, and we're still optimistic that it won't occur. But again, it hasn't been removed from the table either. A big difference is the amount of state aid, that the variation of state aid impact across school districts depending on the type of school you are and the amount of aid that you receive.
So the more you depend on aid, the harder that reduction is.
Yes, bigger impact.
So I have one more for you, and then we have a couple more I want to get in here. I know I'm watching the clock here as I always do, but we had a couple community members who are concerned about safety around the school district, given the kind of the heightened activity around our nation right now in this time of unrest. And Mr. Sanders, you reached out to our local police department to see kind of where we are in these next few days for getting some additional security around the district. And I hope you could update us on that.
Yes, I spoke to Chief Dan McNally of the Guilderland Police Department. They've been partners with us in all of our security planning efforts. I've been a close partner. We have a school resource officer, and we're in regular communication with them, as well as Albany County Sheriff's Department, who assist us in our planning, safety and security planning. They are in tune with what's happening, and they have resources at both the local level. They're aware of what's going on at the state level, and they're also aware of the monitoring that the FBI is doing. All of those agencies are hard at work right now, keeping their eyes and ears open for any signs of what may transpire in terms of some sort of security threat. Right now, there is no credible threat toward any schools in the area or in the region, but they are continuing to monitor that. We will have increased police presence around our schools as a precautionary measure, and the town has agreed to do that. So at this point in time, I think those are good and prudent measures. And again, I was assured that they would continue to monitor, and any adjustments that would need to be made, any information that needed to be shared with us would be communicated. We would know, and we'd be able to plan and act accordingly. And we have the full support of our local police department, and that would include the county and state police as well.
And we are so appreciative of our quality partnerships with those agencies.
Yes,
Very
they've been outstanding.
All right, I want to just shift for a couple minutes here to some HR related questions. So I'm going to put Mr. Johnson on the spot here a little bit. We had a few questions that I think fall under your umbrella. One from a staff member seeking clarity on how it works when you are absent from work when related to a quarantine or to a COVID related absence. Could you briefly address that?
Sure. So good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Wiles. Real quick before I start, I kind of want to echo what Mike Piscatelli's talked about with his high school staff. I want to talk about it from the district staff perspective and how important every team member has been to getting this off the ground, and from building it in the summer to planning for the second semester, and now even looking at the following school year. So thank you, everybody, for what you're doing, and it's certainly appreciated. In terms of staff absences, there's been a change from the first part of the school year to January 1st. The federal Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, or the Family First Coronavirus Act, that money has gone away as of January 1st. What has continued is the New York State Paid Leave Act, which covers people who are in a local, state, or federal quarantine. So we really have been managing a ton of questions around these leaves and what's covered before the end of the school year or the end of the calendar year, and what's covered now. And so in the first part of the year, we were dealing with some childcare issues when child school were closed. So staff would have issues around that, or a family member in the house who's dealing with symptoms, the staff member themselves having symptoms. So right now, the only situation that's covered is that quarantine situation.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Kind of related to that, we had a question from a community member who is, following that we have to from time to time go remote in a building or a part of a building because we are short on staff because they're quarantined. And they suggested, well, are there other alternatives? Can we bring in college students, student teachers? And can you say a few words about that?
Sure. So in terms of bringing college students in, without going through the BOCES sub approval process, we don't have the ability to do that. We do have the ability to redeploy staff, which we have done quite often here in the last several months. When a building has gone remote and we've got some in-person staff who would need to be redeployed in terms of their job description. So this has happened most often with high school staff, and then being redeployed to the middle school and some of the elementary buildings to kind of relieve some of the pressure off from those buildings. I know that Mr. Laster has certainly appreciated all of the high school people that have been redeployed to his building, and Dr. Lockwood has benefited from that in his building too. But we don't have the ability just to take anyone off the street to come in and work with our kids. They've got to go through the BOCES approval process. And we've been working with BOCES to try to get as many subs to take those positions. We also, in many of our buildings, hired a building sub who didn't have them and wouldn't have them normally during a regular school year. We called them the sub squad. And so they've been doing a great job. We have lost one or two as they've gotten positions in other districts. But we're doing our best to keep everyone afloat.
So I know we're close here, but there's a question that came in and it's timely. And I think it's worth talking about. And that is the rationale, and Mike Piscatelli, I guess I'm putting you on the spot here yet again. And it's the rationale for closing our high school in 2 and 3 day increments rather than just closing for full weeks. You'll see some of our neighbors will just close for the week. And I will foreshadow what I know your answer is, because we talk about this constantly, how every situation is unique. And before we're making a decision and what to do with remote or in person, we're looking at lots of variables. Can you speak to kind of what goes into, is it 2 days, 3 days, 5 days, et cetera?
Well, I think we've talked about it, that when we do a closure, it's due to a staff shortage. And so we can forecast and see where we're going to be more accurately in 2 to 3 day increments than we could if we start going out weeks from there. So that's number one. Number two, we're trying to keep to a minimum the number of remote days, because we recognize the harmful nature of that to students. So we think it's better to have the students in person. So we're always going to lean on the side of we're keeping the remote days as low as we can possibly do it. The other thing is it's circumstances too. If you look at the last 2 weeks, we were in school through Monday through Wednesday. And Wednesday we recognized we were going to have a staff shortage the next 2 days. So we shut down for that week. But when we were looking forward to that Monday, we were in good shape for that. We opened up on Monday, we were fine. Tuesday, and then we get notified of a recent case, and that throws everything into flux, and now we're looking out. We did take into consideration now that we do not want to be in this tenuous situation where we don't know if the next day is going to be hybrid or remote. So when we looked at this week, we said, yeah, we've got to make sure we go out for these 3 days for this week. So it is very situational, but it's always on the premise of, number one, it has to deal with staff shortages, and number two, we want to keep that number as low as we can possibly do it.
All right, thanks so much for that. A quick comment, we had some students wondering where their new Chromebooks are. And I want to just say that the message that we keep getting is that they are back ordered and on the way. We hope they arrive soon. We know that school districts really all over the country have ordered tremendous numbers of devices, and we're in a steep competition to get ours here. So students, be patient. We appreciate that. The last thing I want to mention is we had a person write in who wanted to express genuine concern for our hardworking school nurses who are on the real front lines of the health and safety of our children and our faculty and our staff in our buildings. So I thought that would be a nice way to wrap up our work tonight, to recognize our school nurses and how hard they're working and really doing the problem solving and answering the hard questions and the difficult phone calls so that we can be here. So Mary, to you and to all of your peers, we thank you very much. And you tell us what you need that we can provide, and because we want to support you in your very critical work. So having said that, I broke the rule. We're 11 minutes past the 8:30 end time. Is there anyone else feeling like we left a stone unturned here this evening?
Marie, I did remember the other thing was, I think there was the question about events for especially seniors.
Yes.
Like at this point, it's too early to say, but we're going to obviously keep track of this, and we're already talking about pulling together a committee to start planning what that potentially could look like if the situation stays the same, or if we go more towards a more normal school year, end of school year. So
I'm so glad you remembered that, because that's very high on the list of our students' concerns. Well, let me thank all of our panel members for being here tonight and responding to some awesome questions from our community. We really appreciate the opportunity to help people understand kind of what we're working in and through and toward during this school year. So thank you, Neil and Mike and Amy and Alan, Tim, Regan, Mary, and our team up in the booth who are broadcasting us. And thank you all who joined us tonight. Please don't forget to look for our thought exchange tomorrow, and have a great rest of your evening. Good night, everybody.